Good evening and a warm welcome to all our viewers. My name is Samantha Castle and I'm the Senior Manager for Alumni Relations at the University of Pretoria. Tonight, we are proud to present another exciting edition of our LeadUP Alumni Virtual Chats. This discussion this evening is titled Celebrate Bosses Day by putting your employees first and committing to a work environment that is free of bullying and intimidation. This evening, Sibinzili Nkambule, Executive Officer for Strategic Partnership at the LeadUP Foundation and a very proud UP alumna, will moderate a thought-provoking discussion on what constitutes bullying, how it typically plays out in the workplace, and how employees and employers can deal with it. Sibinzili will be joined by a panel of leading experts who will deliberate on how relations between employers and employees can be improved. Thank you for tuning in. We really do appreciate your ongoing support. Now, without any further ado, allow me to introduce to you our Vice Chancellor and Principal, who also happens to be our boss, Professor Tawana Kupe, to say a few words in honor of celebrating Bosses Day on Friday. Prof. Kupe.
A very warm good evening to everybody. I'm proud to be the boss of the University of Pretoria, Takis or Tax of Nicks, as we affectionately call it. I'm also proud for several other reasons. The university is doing very, very well. We have, since COVID-19 struck, decided to see it as that there is a silver lining on every dark cloud. So, and an opportunity for us to rethink and reimagine the University of Pretoria, of course, in the context of a reimagined higher education system and a reimagined South Africa, where out of the ashes of COVID-19 and also out of the disruptions of the last 2 or so decades, what I call the age of disruptions, technology, economics, politics, ecology, and environment. It's been an age of disruptions. We can recreate a better kind of society, one that is that is actually prosperous, equitable, equal, where there is social justice, and also where there is harmony between humanity and nature, and we use resources in a sustainable way. We're doing very well in some of the major rankings. Our engineering school is the best. Faculty is the best in South Africa and Africa, 227 in the world. The others only start at 400 or so. Doing well also in the impact rankings, which measure how research the research we do actually transforms lives, sectors, and communities out there. We came out number 1 in a number of the SDGs. If you can see on my lapel, the 17 SDGs UN badge. We also have built 4 new collaborative transdisciplinary research platforms: Future Africa Institute and Campus, Engineering 4.0, All Things for IR, a new art center with 9 galleries, and we've started building Innovation Africa at UP. Our business school, where one of our panelists, and to our panelists, a very thank you, illustrious panelists. One of our panelists, Ngao Mote, comes from our business school, still number 1 on the continent, number 53 on the Financial Times Executive Education. So the university is in a very good space, has done very well in deploying online teaching, albeit in emergency mode. In our reimagining, UP will be a digital savvy, future focused, future oriented university that gives high quality degrees, but also produces riches that matters to transforming our country and our continent. Last but not least, I'm proud also to say that UP recognizes that bullying is a form of discrimination and is undesirable in the workplace. Last year, we passed a comprehensive Anti-Discrimination Act, which we are going to be socializing across the university now, which has bullying as one of the acts of anti-discrimination that is outlawed in the workplace. We also passed an escalation policy which employees can use to report bullying in whatever shape and form it happens, for the simple reason that we want to create a nurturing and enabling environment for people to get the best degrees in quality education and to do the best research that is transformative. So enjoy, welcome. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to Samantha, Senior Manager, Alumni Relations, and let's enjoy the debate.
Thank you, Prof. Kupe. We look forward to all your comments in the comment section of slido.com. Please feel free to also share this video after this event. Over to you, Sibenzile. I am looking forward to a very exciting conversation on a topic that I think is so important to all of us.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Samantha, and thank you to you, Professor Kupe. Hello, my name is Sebenzile Nkambule. I am the Executive Officer for Strategic Partnerships at the Other Foundation, which is an African philanthropic trust, and we work in 13 Southern African countries. I'm also a proud University of Pretoria alumni, and I will be your moderator today. Please do remember that we would love to continue to engage you. I will have some poll questions for you as well, and you can access those on slido.com. We are talking about Bosses Day. Celebrate Bosses Day. It's a discussion about putting your employees first and committing to a work environment that is free of bullying and intimidation. I'm excited about the diverse panel of experts that will be joining me this evening to really deliberate on how relations between employers and employees can in fact be improved. Some of the questions or the topics that we'll be covering, as Samantha has already mentioned, is what constitutes bullying actually, right? How does it play out in the workplace and particularly within the workplace, right? Within the higher education sector as well. How does it show up? How can it be resolved? And how can employers and employees deal with bullying in the workplace? Of course, the event is brought to you by the University of Pretoria. Without any further ado, let me introduce our panelists. Mr. Bradley Workman-Davies is the director at Worksman's Attorneys. Ms. Brightness Mongoloti is the director at HERS SA. Ms. Levandri Pillay is a clinical psychologist in private practice. And Dr. Mutse, as Professor Cooper has already referred to, is a lecturer at the University of Pretoria's Gordon Institute of Gibbs. Do go to slido.com and you access it by using hashtag LeadUP 14 October. That's where you can post all of your questions. If you already have some thoughts, don't hold back, go for it already. However, my first poll question is, would you like to learn more about how relations between employers and employees can be improved? Two options: one, yes, I would, or two, no, I would not. I will have two other questions for you throughout our conversation. So let me jump straight into it now and bring in our panelists. I'll start with you, Dr. Mutse. Let's start with defining what workplace bullying actually entails, and perhaps if you can link to that is what some of the stereotypes that people have about workplace bullying.
Thank you, Sebenzile. For starters, there are many definitions about what workplace bullying is. Many of them are country-specific or region-specific, precisely because research is showing that context matter. So, but one of the things that all these definitions agree on, what is common about them is that bullying is repeated abusive conduct, which is which intends to mistreat individuals and cause harm to those that it's directed to. One of the ways that it comes through the features of bullying is that it can either be subtle, what is often referred to as gaslighting, or it can be outright. Examples of subtle bullying is that manipulation, intimidating, and often happening behind closed doors. And the overt type of bullying is, the shouting, the demeaning, screaming at somebody typically and usually in the presence of other of the person's peers. To your question about what some of the myths are around bullying, is that it's tough management. I think the most common myth is that it's not bullying, it's tough management. Well, here's the thing. My thing is that good managers manage and bad managers bully. And often what happens is that the managers that bully hide the incompetence or the inadequacy. So they bully to take away the attention from themselves, from the inadequacies that they may have. One of the other common myths is that people that are being bullied, victims, are weak, and or the thing that is associated with them, or the first question would also be, what did you do to bring bullying to yourself? The whole notion about it takes two to tango. And what I've found in my experience working in organizations and doing research, that this myth is not actually true, is that in some instances, the people that are being bullied are some of the strongest people I know, people that perform, people that can stand for themselves. So the reason might tie back to the point I said earlier about diverting attention from the incompetence. So there are many others, but I would stop at this point, and we can come back to that later.
Sure, and let me bring in Levandri now, just picking up on our point there about the role players, right? So we are talking about bosses who are meant to be the leaders in organizations, and the kinds of relationships that they have with the people that they lead, right? So what are some of the effects that you have seen in your experience in terms of how workplace bullying creeps into the target's personal life, but perhaps also speak to how it creeps into the boss's personal life as well?
That's a very interesting and an important question, I think, because the impact of workplace bullying is far-reaching. In terms of the target's personal life, it's the physical impact is increased risk of heart disease, increased blood pressure, chronic pains, stress, inability to sleep, poor eating habits. And then it just goes further with psychological difficulties developing, from depression to fibromyalgia, which is a form of chronic pain that cannot be understood very well. You don't really know where the pain's coming from. You also lack in motivation to do your job, and you lose enthusiasm for your job. You want to avoid going to work. The anxiety of going to work is so severe that often people start calling in sick days more and more. And that not only impacts the employee now, it also impacts the employer, because his business is obviously not thriving because the people that are working for him are not comfortable or happy.
Bradley, it's a good point for you to jump in here about what the law actually says about workplace bullying in South Africa, and what employers and employers should always have in the back of their minds, particularly given the physical impact that it can have, and the effect that can have on the business.
Yeah, thanks, Sebenzile. So I would have to agree with Levandri, where she said that over and above the physical impact that it could have on the individual, there's certainly productivity factors which need to be taken into account, even just from an objective perspective. It's massively demotivational. It can have a massive impact on the ability of a company to achieve its objectives. So it's certainly something which, not just from a legal or an ethical perspective, would need to be addressed, but even purely from those productivity or economic imperatives. One of the other issues I just wanted to point out is that the law, at least in South Africa, provides quite a robust framework for dealing with these kinds of issues within the workplace. And it was hinted at by Professor Coupe in his address, where he talked about the fact that the university has got a particular policy which recognizes bullying as unfair discrimination. And that's exactly correct, because in terms of the Employment Equity Act, which came onto the books as a South African statute in about 1998, there is a prohibition against unfair discrimination within the workplace. And it was recently introduced by an amendment to the Employment Equity Act that harassment is now recognized as a form of unfair discrimination. So there are now very specific legal obligations on an employer to take active steps to eliminate and prohibit and prevent unfair discrimination. And again, harassment is a form of unfair discrimination within the workplace. So there's also legal consequences for an employer if it fails to discharge that legal obligation. It can, in fact, have almost an unlimited liability, which can be awarded by the labor courts if an employee is able to prove that workplace bullying or harassment or victimization or intimidation has taken place. And after having brought that to the attention of the workplace, which in certain circumstances is more or less difficult depending on the size of the organization, the internal resources and structures of that organization to be able to deal with those kinds of complaints, the employer may actually be found by a forum such as the labor court not to have done enough to protect employees from that unfair harassment. So there's extensive legal consequences over and above the practical productivity implications which can arise.
From the employer's perspective, Bradley, staying with you, what is doing enough, right? So the institution can produce policies, maybe 13 pages or 60 pages. You send them to your employees, you send them to your staff. They're most likely they're not likely to read them, right? Then what?
That's very likely. So anecdotally, we do find that when advising clients, the policies are often brought out after the problem has arisen and people have started to escalate the procedures, but they're not aware of exactly who they should be dealing with. And it may even be that someone such as myself would only get involved at the point in time that it's become a dispute at something like the CCMA or the Labour Court, which with respect is too late. So it's all good and well, and it's a very good thing to have a policy or procedure, but there are also steps which an employer can take. And I think that it's rolled up into that general legal obligation under Section 6 of the Employment Equity Act to take reasonable, appropriate steps to eliminate victimization and unfair discrimination within the workplace, that you can also start to conduct workshops, you can sensitize employees, you can take more active steps, again, depending on the organization and the availability of resources. But if you have a arm's length neutral HR department, they should embark upon proactive steps to make sure that people are aware that policies exist, also that there are potentially structures within the organization which can deal with complaints by employees. Ordinarily, you would find those kinds of policies or handbooks would deal with some kind of a grievance procedure, which would allow employees to whistleblow or at least report to a neutral, objective person within the organization that they're suffering victimization. And within that culture then of compliance, of trying to eliminate and take steps to prevent discrimination within the workplace, as long as employees understand that there is support available within the structure, we very often find that that's the kind of proactive environment which results in people not conducting themselves in an inappropriate manner. Alternatively, if those first instances take place, they're dealt with very early on, which prevents a culture of impropriety building up within that organization.
Mm-hmm. Glad you mentioned culture. Brightness, let me bring you are doing your PhD on bullying in higher education in particular. What sort of cultures are we seeing in that space, and why that particular topic?
Thank you very much. A good evening to all. And just to say happy Bosses Day to all the bosses. Workplace bullying is a very interesting, especially in higher education. What I have found is that the culture of an institution defines and shape whether it enables bullying or not. What I've found in higher education is that the issue of the dynamics of power. Academia is highly competitive, and there is a well-defined hierarchy. And very importantly, in academia, we normally talk about the academic staff and also the support staff. The academic staff also have some form of power, even though it's not the power by virtue of being a head of a department or a director or dean, but because they are also chairing a number of committees within the institution, and that on its own gives them power. But what I've also found is that in higher education, there is also what we call star researchers who bring money into the institution. But these star researchers are also bullying the staff. And you'd find that the university becomes silent about those star researchers because they're cognizant of the fact that if we lose this particular person, that actually means we are going to lose money that is coming into the university. At the heart of workplace bullying, maybe what I need to echo is that workplace bullying, it's not something that is done only by leaders or the bosses. Workplace bullying can be multi-level. What do I mean by that? In a context of higher education, it's multilateral. So there's what we call vertical bullying, where the leader or the line manager bully the staff. There's also horizontal bullying, where it's colleagues bullying each other. There's also what we call upward bullying, where it's the staff or your junior staff, your administrators, bullying the leader of the organization. And importantly, also students have been identified as bullies within institution of higher learning. So if we are to address workplace bullying in higher education, we need to look at multiple stakeholders, and we need to be engaging all these stakeholders in order for us to be able to address workplace bullying. But coming to your point on why did I do research on workplace bullying, I'm passionate on leadership communication. So for me, I'm always interested in understanding how leaders communicate with their employees. And one thing that I've also identified as part of my research area, it's about employee disengagement. I've discovered no matter how much communication takes place within the organization, if the employee are disengaged, then you can pick up that there's something is amiss. And for me, that was an alarm to actually say there is a problem. And one of the key problems that I've identified is workplace bullying. In my post as a former HOD, as a former academic, and also as a former union, I've been able and been involved, and maybe openly I can say I've also been bullied. So that is one of the motivators for me to actually do research on workplace bullying in higher education.
Thank you for that brightness. Remember, we're taking your questions on slido.com. You can use hashtag LeadUP 14 October. There are already some questions coming in. Dr. Matei, this one's for you. Kaya asks, I know a lot of people who always complain about being anxious on Sundays before the start of the work week. Could this be because of bullying and intimidation?
Thank you for that question. Yes, it could be. And one of the things that, to answer that question, one of the things that I forgot to mention earlier in my introduction was that, the bullying has moved from the playground into the boardrooms. And now in the era of working from home, it has taken the shape of cyberbullying. So what happens then, you see that overbearing managers constantly communicating and expecting employees to be online 24/7 because we have accessibilities on our phones all the time. So there's continuous, almost like where were you? You've got to be online, and managers demanding of employees to be switched on 24/7. So that also might I can't remember, I don't know who the name of the person was at Kaya. So Kaya, that might also be the reason, one of the reasons. It may actually be bullying. Remember earlier on what I said was that bullying comes in different forms. Some of it is very, very subtle. And the subtlety, the way it's applied is psychological intimidation to the point where the employee, somebody begins to doubt themselves whether is what is actually happening. Could this not be bullying? So, and one of the things is that watch for the patterns, watch for the repetitive abusive action that happens. And before you know it, you'll start to actually identify the patterns and probably then be able to answer your question as to why, when it comes Sunday afternoon, you're thinking, when you just think about getting back into that building and seeing that person, that is intimidation. That is the subtle, most complex and sophisticated kind of manipulation.
Thanks, Dr. Mutse. Levandri, some questions for you as well. They're coming in thick and fast, and thank you for that. Ngobesa asks, does a person's skin color or culture play a role in bullying at work? And then they add on here that this question stems from farm attacks and the treatment of farm workers. I would actually want to also add to that, does gender also play a role in how bullying shows up in the workplace? Levandri?
Thank you for that. Yes, most definitely. I think there are various criteria that meet workplace bullying. I think more importantly, though, is the fact that the workplace bullying starts targeting people and forcing them to feel like they're inferior in some way or another, whether they're structurally inferior in terms of the business or the corporation, but also because they or not. It just applies to the fact that they are made to feel inferior. And just like Dr. Mutse said, it's really important to look for the signs, because if you look for the signs, you see that they start getting the anxieties because they're preoccupied with the thoughts. And so if you're thinking about different criteria, whether it's race, culture, skin color, all of these things fall away because the workplace bullying becomes the biggest issue.
Mm-hmm. Right,
Can I add to that? There's a thing that's called social identity. And with social identity, there's a whole thing about them and us, and gender, race, religion would fall under that. So one of the things which I found is that in the context of South Africa, for example, there's gendered bullying and there's also racial bullying. Apologies, I just wanted to finish and add on the point that Levandri just made.
No, it's all right. I won't excuse me bullying the moderator. I promise. It's part of robust discussion. One for you, Brightness. Before I go back to Bradley, with specifically a legal one as well. Brightness, there's a question about how do you then change institutional culture, right? You particularly mentioned that around the higher education sector. Perhaps give us 2 or 3 things that really ensure that a culture is entrenched to ensure that the institution is bully-proof.
Okay. For starters, when we talk about changing the organizational culture, I can safely say it's a transformation project. That is one. Institution needs to transform, and it becomes the responsibility of the university to come with intervention that are aimed at transforming or changing the institution. The multi-pronged approach that can be used to actually change the culture of the organization. But I can also say it's not an event. It's not something that you do once off. It starts by saying we are zero tolerant of bullying as an organization and committing to the process. When you have policies, communicating those policies, when people report their cases of bullying, ensure that you provide the support that is needed for the employees. Because you might find that in organization, although you have beautiful policies that are anti-workplace bullying, but the problem becomes a case where it's not about the bullying per se, it's about who is bullying and who is the bully. In a case where organization takes sides, that creates a problem. And I found also in institution of higher learning, there is a silencing that takes place. So there needs to be a mechanism that encourages people to actually speak up, and people can only speak up when they see that when they report cases of bullying, there's something that happens within the organization.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for that, Brightness. We're going to get the results for our first poll in just a second. Our second poll, that question, the question here is, Would you like to learn more about what recourse you are entitled to as an employer or an employee in untenable relations with colleagues? Yeah, so that's the question. Would you like to know more about what recourse you are entitled to as an employer or an employee in untenable relations with colleagues? The poll is on slido.com. Use hashtag LeadUP 14 October if you haven't already participated in the first question that we had. An interesting question here, Brian. I'm going to pose it to you in addition to the legal one that I had cited. Power dynamics are quite interesting. So Devi asks here, as women in a senior position, we're exposed to bullying on a daily basis. So how do women handle these situations? And I'd love for you to speak broadly to power relations. So if somebody feels that, say they're an intern, right, or an entry-level employee, they feel that the most senior person in the organization is always picking on them and the culture allows for it, what steps can they actually take? But then also for somebody senior like Devi, who also experiences it, how do they actually approach, what recourse is there for them?
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to answer that question. I also just wanted to add on something to the previous question, which was asked about the link between, for example, race and gender with bullying. And from a legal perspective, there's a direct link. So what I had indicated earlier is that harassment or workplace bullying is dealt with in terms of the Employment Equity Act under that larger banner of unfair discrimination. And although that definition and that concept of unfair discrimination is very broad, and in fact, it allows an employee to be protected by his employer. And it creates that legal obligation on the employer to take active steps to prevent harassment on the basis of what's called any arbitrary ground. That definition of unfair discrimination actually has specific, what we call listed grounds, which are specific prohibited grounds upon which you shouldn't harass or victimize or intimidate or discriminate against the employee. And some of those are not unexpectedly race, gender, sexual orientation, marital status, culture, political opinion. So it's absolutely recognized by the law that there are instances, and probably primary instances, where people are going to be harassed as a result of race or gender. So again, your primary recourse in terms of the Employment Equity Act, if you're being harassed on any of those bases, is to claim the protection under the unfair discrimination banner. Then to answer the second question, and I think it flows from that, is that the law is fairly dispassionate when it comes to dealing with employees who are entitled to these rights. So it doesn't create any distinction between senior or junior managers within the workplace. It doesn't create any distinction between high income earners, low income earners, and it certainly doesn't create any distinction between male or female employees in the workplace. So from a purely cold, dispassionate legal perspective, we would say that if a woman is experiencing harassment or discrimination in the workplace, she's equally entitled as any other person to avail herself of the protections under that general banner. And again, it's a fairly practical consideration as to whether or not the organization has got the internal resources to assist her. But you would certainly say that in order to ultimately get to a point where you could, for example, appeal to a court to compel an employer to give you relief under the unfair discrimination protection provisions, you would have to try to exhaust all of the internal resources available. So, again, if there's a more senior manager, potentially a male senior person to a female junior, you would want to have the conversation directly with that person. I would think that experientially that's very unlikely to resolve the situation. You might then look at a horizontal manager who can potentially mediate the situation. You potentially go above that person's head. Alternatively, you start involving formal grievance procedures, you start involving the HR department, and ultimately you try as much as possible within that organizational structure to try to get somebody to recognize and resolve the situation. If ultimately that just doesn't work, and again, we accept the fact that that might simply be impossible in smaller organizations where, for example, your boss is the top person, he's the CEO, he's the MD, he's the board of directors, he's the chairman, he's the 100% shareholder. Ultimately, there might be nothing that you're going to be able to do, but ultimately you would be able to hold the employer, which would be him personally or his company, again, if it's sort of a sole services company, ultimately he might face an unfair discrimination claim. He might have an award of unlimited liability against him. You could also be quite creative, I think, from a legal perspective and do things like resign, claim a constructive dismissal, link that to what we would call an automatically unfair dismissal on the basis of unfair discrimination, and potentially try to hold them responsible for up to 24 months' salary. So again, the law is quite dispassionate, and it's probably a very clean technical argument from my perspective, and it fails to take into account the human psychology of dealing with people on a personal basis. But there's certainly a very robust mechanism in the law to protect employees from any kind of unfair discrimination, regardless of their status, regardless of their gender, regardless of their exposure within the organization.
Levandri, at what point do you tell people leave, right? So follow the, the legal route. That can be very taxing as well, and both emotionally, financially as well. It can be extremely taxing. At what point do you say to somebody, maybe it's not worth it to fight?
I think before I answer that question, I think I want to just build on the previous question as well. There is, especially when it comes to female employees in higher positions, there's often a feeling that you have to just put up with a lot more in the environment because you are female and you need to prove yourself to others, to whether it's to senior members of staff, or to your colleagues, or to those that you're superior to. So they build this sort of underlying feeling that you can't actually go to the legal route if it needs to be, because you're afraid to make too much noise and you're really trying to prove yourself. And it can be very isolating and very lonely because you feel like you're in this alone. And often the best situation is to speak up about it and talk about it to others, especially to other people that might be feeling similar things. So that's one thing. When do you leave? I suppose everyone can make a different decision, but as soon as it starts impacting your personal life, your private life, especially, I mean, in our research and my experience as well, is I've often seen it go far deeper than just the individual. It goes into the family system as well. And when it starts impacting the family, where you're having increased rates of stress within the family system, poor parent-child relationships, poor marital relationships, it starts impacting you far more than just the work day. It goes beyond the work day and into your personal life. That's when you need to start questioning, is this really what I need to be exposing myself and my family to? Because then it's really not worth it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
What I find, if I may,
sure.
What I find is that to the specific question that was asked about power dynamics, the sad thing though is often the biggest bullies are the bosses, which is why it makes this conversation that we're having very important. Because if you get it right at the leadership level, at the boss level, then, because essentially the culture of an organization takes the shadow of the leader, the way the leader leads. If, for example, there's intimidation, there's bullying happening, and it gets reported repeatedly, and nothing happens about it, that actually creates the culture. So the burden then, the responsibility is on the bosses to actually be intentional about creating and cultivating a culture that is human. I often speak about bringing humanity back into organization. And one of the ways, the practical ways that you can do that is starting with the basics, especially within the context of South Africa, where bullying is not really well spoken about. We're still keeping silent about it. So one of the first things you could do is just raise awareness about bullying, about what it is, what constitutes bullying, in what form does it come, and most importantly, define it for ourselves. Define what does it mean for ourselves within the context of the organization. So I think that is the starting point. And it's great we may have specific procedures and legal recourses, but if the biggest bully is the boss, nobody's going to speak up or stand up to the boss, and especially if they are the best performers, for example, in terms of bringing in business, which typically tends to happen. So it really, really does start with the bosses, the leaders, to really get it and create and be intentional about creating and cultivating an environment where everybody else can feel safe.
Mm-hmm. Brightness, how does it differ in academia, if at all?
There is not so much difference, but maybe to build up. I'm hearing the conversation, it's about intergroup dynamics. That is black on white or colored. We also need to acknowledge that there is bullying intra-groups, that is amongst the same race. That is black on black, white on white. So that conversation is also important. But also to acknowledge that within gender, the intra-dynamics of gender also, that does not necessarily mean that bullying is a male against a female. Although we know for sure that the majority of the bullies are males, but there is also a prevalence of women bullying other women. So that is a reality that we need to appreciate and that we also need to engage upon. Because I found sometimes people think just because I'm black, I cannot be bullied by a black person, or just because I'm white, I cannot be bullied by a white person, or just because I'm a woman, I cannot be bullied by another woman. So that dynamic is important also to unpack. But coming back to your question, higher education, in fact, research is proving that higher education and the public sector are the sectors that have a high prevalence of workplace bullying. And as I've echoed earlier with what is happening in higher education, the academic space is highly competitive. And what is also interesting about higher education is that the leadership in higher education is normally drawn from ranks of faculty. And that actually means that those who are in leadership position, in most cases, they are not trained to be leaders. So you find someone who moves up from the rank, being a lecturer, senior lecturer, associate professor, being a professor, and by virtue of being professor, then being appointed to being a director or the dean of the faculty. In most cases, those people do not come from a management discipline where they are taught about leadership skills. So it becomes a responsibility of a leader to empower themselves. And we know very well that most of them are not interested. They believe by virtue of being a professor, that actually means I know it all. Unfortunately, that's the case. But some of the dynamics that happen in higher education is the reality that there is a difference between permanent staff and permanent and temporal staff. You'd find some of the academics are not appointed full-time. They're appointed on contract. And hence you'd find the contract workers are normally bullied because they want to get a salary. They'll tolerate anything and everything. And sometimes when we talk about bullying, we talk about intimidation. The form of workload, when you're given too much workload, that is a form of bullying on its own. Because if you cannot handle that workload, that means you cannot cope. But unfortunately, what is happening in higher education, there have been a reality of restructuring in higher education, and you find that there are cultural dynamics in universities. Some of the universities have merged because of the restructuring or the merger that was done, I think in 2005. But as much as the university have merged, it's the merger by name, but by behavior and how things are done. You find in one university, you find three cultures. That on its own, it's a challenge that we are having in higher education. And I've echoed the issue of the star researchers, where they bring a lot of money within the institution and everyone dances to their music. And maybe Dr. Mutse, you've alluded to the fact that good managers do not bully. And sometimes there's a perception that it's only bad managers that bully. There's also a reality that Good managers also bully. The narcissists are normally good leaders. They are well informed and they know how to play the psychological. In fact, they say bullying is a game, it's a battle. Somebody has to win. And when they find that you are dominating, or when they find that you are performing better than they are, and you are going to dim their light, they come up with mechanisms to actually exclude you. Higher education also have what we call the culture fit issues. They say people, even in other sectors, they say, you know what, this particular person is not culture fit. Sometimes you are pushed out of the institution, not because you are not culture fit, but because you are interrupting the status quo. So the only way that they can keep the status quo is to push you out of the system. And unfortunately, at this particular juncture, majority rule. If the majority say, Professor Dr. Mutse is bullying them, who are we to dispute that because it's the majority that is saying that? So it's a question of someone being isolated, someone being pushed out of the system. And those are some of the realities that are happening in our workspace as in the higher education context, sadly so.
Mm-hmm. Bradley, jump in here on just the issue of performance, right? So Lishlofanolo asks, how can you deal with bullying disguised as performance dissatisfaction by principals? Is there a legal standpoint there?
Yeah, there is, and it's a strange intersection of the right of an employer to obviously counsel an employee for any objective underperformances. But it's quite possible that the employee's actual underperformance might be as a result of demotivational factors from that person's direct manager. So the employee might well find themselves in a situation where they're not only being bullied and demotivated and therefore not accomplishing all of their normal KPIs or functions and activities, but then actually being found to be underperforming and maybe being taken through some kind of a counseling procedure. And ultimately, the end result of a counseling procedure for the employer is that if the interventions which the employer is required to put in place to try to correct the underperformances are not having that effect, then ultimately the employee could well be dismissed as a result of that underperformance. Now, there is technically, again, a possibility for the employee to use that counseling performance as the forum in which they will talk about the bullying as an explanation for their poor performance. And that is, strictly speaking, also an obligation which is incumbent upon the employer to investigate in those circumstances. It's an actual legal obligation on an employer to address an employee and say, look, we think that you are underperforming. We have objective evidence of your underperformance. You now need to provide us with an explanation as to why this underperformance is taking place. And we then collaboratively need to try to investigate how we resolve the problem which is leading to the underperformance. So again, it may well be that if it's having that impact on an employee's performance, in the course and scope of that performance counseling process, what you would call a PIP, a performance improvement plan, which ordinarily you see employers put in place, the employee would be challenged. They would, in those circumstances, say, well, look, I haven't told anybody about it yet. I haven't really invoked the formal procedures, but now that you're asking me why I'm underperforming, the reason is my boss is pressurizing me. As the Brightner said as well, potentially there's an unfair allocation or distribution of work, which is placing undue pressure on me. That's why I'm not making the objective deliverables. And it's your objective, or it's your legal obligation now as the employer, which might at the very beginning of that counseling process be the manager who is in fact bullying you. But as the process unfolds, and if the employer is correctly complying with its legal obligations to ensure fairness in the objectivity of that review process, it should ultimately get escalated beyond the immediate manager. I mean, ultimately, you might find that the employee is taken into some kind of formal incapacity inquiry, where, strictly speaking, a properly external independent chairperson of a poor work performance inquiry should be asked to adjudicate why the employee is underperforming. And if at that point in time the narrative comes out and that external arbitrator is able to determine that the reason for the objective underperformance is in fact managerial bullying, then what should happen is that the PIP should be withdrawn. In fact, remedial measures should be put in place to prevent that bullying, and the employee should effectively be given a second chance. So essentially, although I can see that there would be practical circumstances in which managerial harassment could lead to underperformance and formal procedures, that could be a double-edged sword for the employer, because that could then be the answer to deal with the situation.
Levandri, let me bring you in again. There was a question earlier from Lorraine. Levandri, you could just add on to this. Lorraine earlier was asking why it is that managers struggle to deal with high performers. Rather, why are leaders intimidated by high performers in the team? To Brightness's point earlier, the star researchers, the high performers, they bring in big bucks for the institution. They then become a bit difficult to manage. Speak to that a bit, please.
So you're asking around the intimidation that encourages the bullying, or is it from a different perspective?
Please repeat that, Levandri. Were you clarifying the question?
Are you asking from a perspective of what encourages bullying? Is that what
so the question is just why are leaders intimidated by high performers in the team?
So I think that it really comes down to your own insecurities. I think that perhaps a lot of bullying comes from a perspective of feeling insecure. So if you go all the way back to playground bullying that we were talking about earlier, it's the bully is usually the one that feels the most insecure and most weak. And as soon as you're feeling intimidated by somebody else who might be better performing or achieving more than you think you could achieve, you feel like you need to exert some sort of power in order to make them feel less superior. And so that's why it encourages people to feel, it encourages bullies to draw on their own insecurities, to push it onto somebody else so that they don't feel so weak and insecure.
Mm-hmm. Brightness, you wanted to jump in there?
Thanks, Sebenzile. The problem with some leaders is that they don't have emotional intelligence. That is one of the problem that exists in most organizations. But what I've also found, picking up on the previous conversation, is that policies are also manipulated within organization. Although policies are meant to protect the employees and also the employer, but research on workplace bullying shows that there's also what they call workplace corruption, where policies are manipulated to advance the bully. For example, the case of a leader, Bradley echoed the issue of a leader being a bully. You might find that the leader is doing some unjust things. And what they do, or they require you to do more work, they require you to do certain things that are not ethical. And when you say no to doing those unethical things, then the leader has the power to actually claim that you are doing what we call an insubordination. You are not doing what you are expected to do. So there's a lot of manipulation that actually takes place. I'm taken aback into cases. If you look into the Zondo Commission and you listen to some of the stories, and when you talk about corruption, and you realize that some of the reason that we have a brain drain in our institution, it's not because people want to exit. It's because people are bullied. It's because when people are pulled into a space of corruption and decide not to be corrupted, then they are bullied by the system. It's because when people are corrupt, which is those who bully, when they want to force you to do certain things that are not ethical and you do not comply to what they say you should be doing, then you become bullied. So there are different angles that we can use to look into the context of workplace bullying. It's not only about the social identity or the issue of race, the issue of gender, or the issue of, I think the issue of social class also is coming up from a context of workplace bullying, where people see you because as Black people, sometimes it's because of the level. I might be Black, but I come from a different social class, and how I behave is totally different. So I think workplace bullying is very dynamic. We should not just use one lens to try to understand it. And maybe what I need to echo is that looking at workplace bullying from an interpersonal perspective, it's limiting also. We also need to look from it also from a group level, where there is a department, there are people that are observing. What is the role of the observer when they see the bullying taking place? Because the observer is not always neutral. Observers can also be enablers of bullying, where they support the bullying. But also let's unpack the issue of the organization. What about the leadership styles of the organization? What enables what is happening? The change in institution of higher education, where you are forced to do more because there is limited resources. That on its own is workplace bullying. But what is happening and what we need to appreciate about workplace bullying is that it's a reflection of our society. So if we can just look at it from a narrow perspective and say it's interpersonal, then we are limiting ourselves.
Great point to end with, Brightness. I have to take a final round of views, I'm afraid. And while I was coming to you, just briefly for us, what should organizations do to prevent and manage bullying and create bully-free environments? Just if you could do it in a minute for me, I'd appreciate that.
I'm not going to do it in a minute, so and you can cut me off. I'll give you permission to bully me on that point. I just wanted to underscore there's a very, very important point that I suppose, as shown by the discussion, it speaks to the complexity of this phenomenon, and a lot of it is very subjective, and which is why the starting point, the important starting point, is awareness and definition. And I think Brightness also spoke to another angle, which is very passionate to me, the issue of context. Context matters, because what I found, for example, in the study that I did, was that it had a South African flavor. So some around transformation, this ageism and social identity. But quickly, to answer your question, Sebenzile, I think one of the things I had already alluded to earlier on, but perhaps it's also important to repeat, because so that it actually lands. It's important to take a stand for leaders, which is why the best gift bosses can give to their employees is to create an environment where employees feel safe to speak up. And how you do that is, firstly, just the noble, simple thing of taking a stand and saying this behavior will not be tolerated. And then the next step, of course, would be defining what that behavior is, what bullying means for us. And then, of course, supporting it with the processes and procedures. Everybody has been talking about policies and things. But the most important thing is also what I want to bring in is that it is not an HR problem. It's not an HR issue. It's everybody else's responsibility. So part of it, that's the thing that's important, is provide training and to key staff and key managers across the organization to make sure that you actually make it alive. In the same way as when we...
That's where we're gonna wrap it up there. Thank you for that. Bradley, I don't know if you can pull a miracle here, but just share your thoughts, high-level thoughts on just how you feel that the law can perhaps be amended or changed in part to really heighten the levels of awareness around this issue in the workplace.
Yeah. Look, I think that the Employment Equity Act has done enough to create that category of unfair discrimination and to create the positive obligation on employers to eliminate and prohibit that culture and that kind of conduct within the workplace. But what I've also indicated to you is that the relief which an employer is entitled to, either to refer a dispute for unfair discrimination or to, for example, resign, claim constructive dismissal, and then claim an automatically unfair dismissal, which in principle have these very robust protective mechanisms and can expose an employer to substantial liabilities, they're actually very impractical, because to go to the labor court for an unfair discrimination claim, to go to the labor court for an automatically unfair dismissal claim means approaching an attorney, means drafting an application, means paying a huge amount of money. It's not as simple, for example, as downloading a form from the CCMA, filling in a 711 and referring a dispute for unfair dismissal or unfair labor practice, which doesn't cost anything. So I think if there was a more robust mechanism which involved the CCMA at a lower level, that would go a long way towards entitling employees to have easier access to that law.
Bradley, thank you very much. Lavendra, you have the final word.
I think ultimately what's important for them to know, or for everyone to know, is that you're not alone. You don't have to suffer through this alone. You can seek help, you can speak out, and you can get the assistance that you need.
Brilliant. Levandri, thank you very much. And thank you to all of our speakers there. So all of our poll results were 100% yes. So thank you very much for that. We have one final question for you, and that question is: how likely are you to refer to this LeadUP event to business colleagues and other alumni, with 1 being very unlikely to 10 being extremely likely? And we do hope that your answer will be the latter. Thank you once again to our panelists, Dr. Ngao Mutse, Mr. Bradley Workman-Davies, Ms. Brightness Mongoloti, and Ms. Levandri Pillay. It has been a fantastic conversation, and thank you very much for joining us. And that's where we wrap it. I am Sebenzile Nkambule. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.